Well, yeah, I appreciate the organizers here inviting me to come do this. It's been fun, and last night was great. Dr. Reynolds' talk earlier, just now that we came from, was wonderful, and I'm really happy to be a part of this. So I envision this going in two parts: the kind of boring stuff, and then the fun stuff. So I'm going to try to get through the boring stuff as quick as I can. My initial idea was to kind of have a break in between and do some Q&A, but we'll see how that goes. I might just go on through to the end and try to leave more time at the end for questions. So on the apologetic uses of fantasy. So first off, let's get this out of the way, right? So there may be some spoilers. I'm not planning on talking about each of these in detail, but they're things that could come up. I saw Logan last night. I'm not going to spoil that for you, though. So I would say it's very rough in the language, incredibly violent. If you're used to the traditional X-Men movies, that's not it. Okay? So it's very in keeping with the comic books, but you may be in for a surprise and a shock if you think it's going to be like Days of Future Past or something like that. But it was a very good movie. So there we have those. So assumptions. I'm not going to assume anything, except I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the stuff we just mentioned, right? So there's some of you who may not be familiar with Tolkien, you may not be familiar with Narnia, you may not be familiar with any of that stuff, and that's okay. I think you can still get something out of what we're doing here, but when we get to those parts, I'm going to just assume that you know what I'm talking about when I talk about those kind of characters and people, okay? If you're here and you're not a Christian, your input and questions obviously are welcome, but I'm also going to be assuming, well, if I actually click on the thing, that works. I'm going to be assuming the Christian perspective, okay? So what I'm doing here is a version of a talk I've already done on this. It's a little bit more elaborated in some ways. But in that talk, I make this point too, right? I mean, my point is not to, in this lecture, defend Christianity. I think there are good reasons. I think, apologetically we can do that. But that's not my goal here. My goal is to do something else. All right? So you're more than welcome to engage any Christian here, to those non-Christians, any Christian here on the merits or truth of Christianity that I'm assuming. But you can keep your questions on the Q&A to the topic at hand. That would be great. All right. So our first part one, apologetics and Christian culture and cultural engagement. All right. So what is apologetics? Right, so we have our first one right here from Douglas. I've been told it's Grotius. Is that right? Yeah, Grotius. Christian apologetics is the rational defense of the Christian worldview as objectively true, rationally compelling, and existentially or subjectively engaging. We also have William Lane Craig. Apologetics is a theoretical discipline that tries to answer the question, what rational warrant can be given for the Christian faith? Therefore, most of our time must be spent in trying to answer this question. And then finally, I have Myron B. Penner from the end of Apologetics. He defines apologetics as the Enlightenment project of attempting to establish rational foundations for Christian belief. I think that it's important before we get to the legitimate apologetic use of fantasy that we try to understand what constitutes a legitimate apologetic use. And to do that, I want to take a critical look at how we've understood the apologetic endeavor in some recent years. So we've got these definitions here. And I think that what we can get from these definitions is that for many Christians, especially for many apologists, Christian apologetics is giving arguments, right? It's giving arguments for the Christian faith. And for those who aren't Christians, I would assume from my interactions that they understand Christian apologetics as Christians merely trying to win those arguments, right? And these things aren't too far off, I think we'll see. But this serves as a basis for Myron Penner's critique of apologetics. When I was first introduced to Myron Penner's works, pardon me, it was very interesting because I was at a national ETS conference, and I was standing in a lobby with some friends, and we were discussing a lecture that we were going to be going to the next day, given by a good friend of mine, Ben Arbor, and a Myron Penner. They were going to be giving an apologetic, a very interesting, don't want to get too sidetracked here, but a very interesting argument on the axiology of belief, which basically just means the view that we should want God to exist, right? So they were giving a really interesting argument that even the atheists should want there to be a God. Well, I had seen, we had turned to this book. I was like, well, isn't that the guy, Myron Penner, that wrote the End of Apologetics book? And one of the people in the circle said, oh, no, that's the bad Myron Penner. So my first taste of hearing about this guy was that he's the bad one. Now, I'm going to come back to that point here in just a little bit, right? Because I think that kind of, I think that's a little telling, that kind of outlook. All right, so what I want to do is I do want to look at, I've got his book here, The End of Apologetics, which is a critical look at apologetics. His subtitle is Christian Witness in a Postmodern Context. I'm not interested in discussing whether or not postmodernism is real or whether it's fabrication. I think it's enough that for many people it is real enough. Okay. Sorry, I want to keep track of time here, so I'm gonna put my clock up here. There's one back there, but there's a little bit of a glare. So I want to first off say that I don't agree with everything that Penner says. I'm not attacking apologetics. I don't think that apologetics is bad or wrong or that we should give it up. Myron Penner does seem to think that in some real way, that we should supplant apologetics with something else, something different that may not be apologetics. But what I do want to suggest is that the critiques that he gives us ought to be taken seriously. I mean, they're very interesting and good critiques, and to the extent that he's helping us think about apologetics, we should certainly take note. So, I want to identify two. Now, he gives a lot of critiques, and I want to identify two of the critiques that he gives, okay? So, first is secularized apologetics, okay? So as I understand it, this criticism gets to the kind of focus that modern apologists have on the arguments and reason that support belief. Such a focus proceeds from a modern assumption about this public sphere in which we all participate in more or less on an equal footing. In this public space, reason is supreme and works to support all other kinds of beliefs from a neutral and objective standpoint. As I see it, this secularization takes place when we think of reason as a kind of objective, neutral standpoint from which we can argue to religious beliefs like God exists or Christ was raised from the dead, rather than thinking of reason as a God-given faculty by which we can come to understand and worship God more fully. So what I'm saying here is that my understanding of Penner's critique is that we have let our reason, our confidence in human reason and the human mind's ability to understand these things supersede belief, or take kind of motivate or push belief in God's existence, right? So it becomes primary, rather than a sort of pre-modern look. Penner talks about this in his book. He kind of sets this up in McIntyre terms of after virtue, where we're talking about pre-modern and post-modern kind of stuff. So the pre-modern ideas, in the pre-modern view, you kind of begin with these assumptions, right, about what the world is, where it came from, for the Christian, that God exists, for example, and then you let those kind of assumptions drive your understanding of how we come to know, of other aspects of philosophy, of apologetics, and so on. When we get to this modern turn, that flips around so that we start to think about, well, what is it that we know first? How do we know, right? Let's think about our human understanding first, and then let's figure out whether or not we should believe something like God exists. And I think that kind of flips things around in a way that is problematic for the Christian apologist. And I think this is part of Penner's critique. As Penner puts it, we require arguments and evidence for belief in God, and failing that, we at least need a very good explanation, an epistemology perhaps, like Reformed epistemology, of how it is that belief in God is reasonable and counts as knowledge for us. Now, I think Penner's point may be a bit strong here. I see nothing wrong, as I've said before, and only inherent benefits to being able to provide a rational structure for explaining knowledge claims that are made by the Christian. However, what I do find problematic is an approach that places this kind of rationale front and center in the Christian life. So if we were to focus, if our focus is the strength of our arguments and whether our worldview makes the most sense, then apologetics devolves into a kind of my argument can beat up your argument, right? And if you've ever been to one of these debates, not last night. Last night was, I got to say, kind of a shining example of, I think, the kind of thing that Penner is worried about. Not the kind of thing he's worried about, but the kind of solution to the kind of thing that he's worried about. I was really impressed with how things went down last night. So, yeah. So I'm not. I think that there's a place for this, right? But again, if we focus on these things, then it's this my argument can beat up your argument approach, which I think is problematic. Furthermore, in this neutral space focused on the merits of arguments and the success of worldviews, it turns out that we're really doing nothing different than our secular counterparts, right? Because they're coming from the same modern assumptions, the same modern perspective, right? I'm going to start with this neutral space. I'm going to gather evidence. I'm going to put these things forward, right? So Penner's point here, I take it, is that there's this kind of foundational secular perspective that we begin from when we think about it this way. If Penner is right, even in the slightest sense, then we should take notice. An apologetics focused on arguments and worldviews is not an apologetic of the Christian faith, but rather an apologetic of human reason in the context of a Christian faith. And again, I want to point out there's nothing wrong with that, but it looks a lot less like evangelism and looks more like trying to defend my own ability to argue in the public space. And I just said that in my notes here, so I can skip that. My overriding concern in all of this is that we are inadvertently leaving Christ as an afterthought of apologetics at best, and out of it altogether at worst. We should not forget that it is Christ resurrected that is the reason for the hope that is within us, right? This passage that apologists like to point to and say, well, this is what motivates my apologetic work. Well, if that's true, we shouldn't forget that the reason that Peter talks about there is the resurrection of Christ. It's not arguments. Arguments aren't the reason in that passage. So, there's that one. So the second one, I'm going to, so here I have a passage from Penner to this end, right? The degree to which contemporary apologetics and apologists share this aim of modern thought and attempt to make Christian beliefs rationally warranted or justified, according to the modern project, is the same degree to which they are a version of secular apologetics. So the second critique from Penner I want to look at is apologetic violence. He lists two types, but in interest of time, I'm only going to address the first one. So the first one here is a kind of rhetorical violence that occurs whenever a witness is indifferent to others as persons and treats them objectively, as objects defined by their intellectual positions on Christian doctrine or as representatives of certain social subcategories. This seems to me to be a kind of label and dismiss kind of approach. And again, I think unfortunately we see this a lot, right? Especially in these debates. I'm going to debate an atheist. The atheist says this, the atheist believes that, right? I'm going to label, notice that this isn't just on the apologist side, right? This is, I think, kind of an inherent kind of problem in this kind of discourse, right? Because insofar as we are labeling, we are being labeled as well, right? And what's wrong with labels? Well, they're helpful, certainly, right? I mean, but it seems to me that when we do this, we stop engaging with the person, we stop engaging the person with the Christian witness, and we rather engage the arguments themselves or those labels, right? So if apologetics is to be evangelical, then we need to be focused on engaging the person, not engaging the arguments per se, or engaging the labels that we're creating to describe those people, but we need to remember that we're engaging the people themselves, right? So, so when we do this, it creates a situation in which hopefully we are inadvertently depersonalizing individuals and that we're engaging. It's, as I said, the label and dismiss method of apologetic discourse. And we do this as though calling someone an Arminian or a Calvinist, Baptist or Catholic, a believer or unbeliever, a theist, Christian or atheist, as though this tells us all we need to know about them for the purposes of evangelism. And I mean, hopefully that kind of puts it in the nutshell, right? I mean, because if you think the only thing I need to know about the person before me is that they're an atheist in order to engage them in a witness for the gospel, then I think you're misunderstanding what witnessing for the gospel is. So I take this criticism seriously. Part of Penner's point here, and one that I agree with, is that we must take into account the person we witness to, not merely the arguments they present. Now, I do want to make a note about offense, right? Because it could be interpreted that what I'm saying is that we should be careful not to offend somebody, because if I put a label on them, then I run the risk of offending them. And that's not necessarily what I'm saying. I don't know that whether or not we're offending somebody should be our focus, because we're told that the gospel is going to be offensive, right? But what I do want us to understand is that I don't get to decide, and you don't get to decide, whether the person that you're talking to feels offended, right? You get to decide whether you're going to act intentionally in ways that are offensive. And I think insofar as we do this and it's not on account of Christ, it's not on account of the gospel, we're doing something wrong. We may be doing something idolatrous, like Dr. Reynolds was talking about before, putting something up above Christ. But we do need to try to keep that in mind. So the second one, and again, I'll mention this and then we'll move on, is a kind of systematic or ideological violence that takes place in modern rational societies. So what I take this to be is this, he talks about Kierkegaard here in a kind of spirit of leveling, this kind of attempt to make everybody on the same equal footing, which sounds really nice and good, but when we do that, we consume worldviews and cultures and nuances and differences in such a way that we kind of make everybody look the same and make everybody kind of carry the same face. And he calls this a more subtle form of this kind of apologetic violence, but because it's subtle, he finds it a little more insidious. All right, so how should we respond to these things? How should we respond? Well, I don't know. I don't know. I was really interested in looking at this. I encountered this book and started reading it back in November, and it just hit me between the eyes. And again, like I said, I don't think I agree with everything that Penner says, but the criticisms were very stark to me, very, very convicting to me. And so I'm still thinking these things through, but here's what I do think. I suspect that it begins at the very least with a broadening of our understanding of what it means to engage in apologetics, like we've been talking about. Are there ways to act apologetically without engaging natural theological arguments and potentially falling into the traps identified with Pinner. And that's what I'm trying to move toward. So that the focus, when we think about fantasy here, the focus isn't going to be on what arguments can I create, but on what ways can I present the gospel and defend my faith to this person or clarify my faith to this person that can meet them where they are, right? Because not everybody's going to be interested or persuaded by the ontological argument. Not everybody's going to be interested in or persuaded by the cosmological argument. And the fact that they're not interested in it doesn't make them a deficient person. It doesn't make them any less worthy of our conversation efforts. Whatever our response, it should be one that takes the criticisms seriously, not merely perpetuating the secularization and violence that Pinner accuses modern apologetics of. So our response shouldn't be, well, Myron Pinner is just the bad Myron Pinner, because he disagrees with what I'm up to, right? It should be to take these things seriously and think, how can I let these criticisms that seem valid, legitimate criticisms, how can I make these push me forward and thrust me forward into more proper and effective ways of engaging people for the gospel? All right, so now we're going to move into the fun stuff, all right? Well, I think it's fun. So I want to suggest then a method for cultural engagement that I'm referring to as cultural hermeneutics. So what do I mean by cultural hermeneutics? Culture must be engaged as though it has something to tell us regarding truth. Culture has to be engaged so that when we go to culture, we think, there's something true here. What is it? Right? I think that's kind of primary. I'm a Berkeleyan. I was told not to talk about my idealism, but I'm going to do it anyway. Idealism is the view that minds, that there is no mind-independent reality. John Mark Reynolds talked about this briefly last night. I'm a Christian idealist. I don't want to get bogged down in that. If that confuses you or if that worries you, don't let it. That was my dissertation defense, and they still gave me the degree. So, and that was here. So, yeah. So Berkeley, but this is the point I want to make about Berkeley. On the kind of following his idealism, Berkeley believed that creation constituted a divine language, right? So I want us to think about that for a minute. If it's a divine language, if creation is a divine language, then it's something that we should learn how to read, right? And insofar as culture is a component or an aspect of creation, it's at the very least it's an outworking of created creatures, people, us, then it seems like there's going to be something here for us to read, something for us to interpret. That's why I call this cultural hermeneutics, a kind of interpretation of culture. But we got to be careful, because culture lies sometimes. If culture tells us truth is fundamentally relative to individual preference or societal whims, then this is false. But not always, right? Culture lies, but not always. If culture tells us that we should act towards our neighbors in a loving and charitable way, this is true. So, but notice here that each of these engagements, we're still engaging culture as though there is something true there, right? In some cases, the truth that's there is that what culture is telling me is false. In some cases, the truth that's there is what culture is telling me is true. So we need to approach these things Christianly. Here's some other examples. If cultures tell us that vampires sparkle, this is false. If you don't get this joke, look around to someone who's laughing and you can ask them later. All right? Losing their edge. I love that Count Chocula is a part of that too. That's great. Count Chocula is more. If culture tells us that Peter Jackson's The Hobbit trilogy was a mistake, this is true. That it was between this meme and there was another one where it was a picture of a photoshopped, obviously, picture of the book, and it said The Hobbit, special edition edited by Peter Jackson, and it was like this big. And so I chose the classic meme here instead. All right. So, cultural hermeneutics. The Christian should engage culture as though something profoundly true is there, as I've said, sometimes boldly on the surface and sometimes hiding in the crevices. The work for the Christian cultural hermeneutist, then, is to try to identify what is true about our culture. Okay? Now, this leads me to part 2, but I see that I'm already running a little bit over, I think. Yeah, so I'm going to just move on through. So we're moving towards this, towards applying apologetics here, right? So just move on to part 2, the apologetic uses of fantasy. So let's think about fantasy first, okay? So when I'm thinking about fantasy, first I want to talk about fictional realism. Now, this is a kind of a technical term, and there's a lot of different, as a lot of these kind of terms are in philosophy, there's a lot of different ways to think about this. So let me define what I mean here, okay? What I mean by fictional realism is the view that fictional objects are real. Thus, the stories we're about to discuss are about real things and people and places with real qualities and geographies and personalities. Lewis and Tolkien called this what? Does anybody know what they called this? Mythopoeia, right? Isn't that how you pronounce it? Mythopoeia. So this idea of creating mythic subcultures. We'll talk about that more in detail here in a minute. But this idea that you create this kind of reality, and it is reality. We know that, for example, Hobbiton lies to the east of the Misty Mountains. If I were to say otherwise, I'd be speaking falsely. It wouldn't be true. Is it west? I'm sorry, west. Thank you. East of the Blue Mountains. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I just got my east and west mixed up. That's okay. It was a test. See, I said something. I said something false, and somebody corrected me, right? So, yeah. So again, I'm being generous with this term, as you can tell, right? This fictional realism. Technically, the term refers to the metaphysical status of fictional objects. Are fictional objects real or not? And much of this depends on what we mean by real. For example, one may claim that reality is best defined as a theory of truth. On the other hand, one may claim that reality is best defined as mind independence. So, for example, that's the one that I like to think about, right? For example, certainly there is a sense in which Treebeard, the great guardian of the Fangorn forest, is different from, say, my friend David. Right up here, my friend David. It's the one with the big beard. So, we may say that the greatest difference, though probably not the only difference, is that David really exists and Treebeard does not. But is that the real distinction? I can say things about Treebeard that many of you here now would balk at. For example, if I were to say that Treebeard is a hobbit, the answer to this would be no. If I were to say that Treebeard has supple, milky, white skin like the fairest of elven queens in Lothlorien, no. The sense in which Treebeard is different from David is certainly not in failing to truly reflect such statements, but rather in how each of these things is real. We might say that David is real in a mind-independent way, though I doubt it because of refer you back to the Berkeleyan idealism stuff. But I think David depends on God's mind. That's kind of where I'm getting at there. But he certainly doesn't depend on any of our minds, right? He's real in that sense. While Treebeard is not. He's not real in this way. But this doesn't get to the distinction either. From a Christian perspective, David may not be all that mind independent because he depends on God's mind. And Treebeard certainly doesn't depend on my mind, yet he exists. Indeed, now that he's been created and Tolkien is dead, he doesn't really, at this point, depend on anybody's mind, right? He's just there. I think that this gets close to what we can take this distinction to be. It's a distinction of creation. When we think about what makes fictional objects real and what makes us real, it's the creation aspect. It's not whether we're real or not, it's in what way are we real, right? How are we created? And we'll come back to this here in just a minute. So fantasy. So this is how I'm thinking about these fictions, these fantasies. And I'm going to use the idea of fantasy broadly. What I'm about to say is probably heretical in some places, but that's okay. Because I'm going to include myths, fairy stories, science fiction even, in what I'm thinking about here. Now, science fiction like Star Trek, for example, there's going to be debate, right, about whether or not Lord of the Rings and Star Trek are both fantasy, right? One is fantasy, one is science fiction. Well, I've been watching a lot of Star Trek recently, and there's a lot of fantastical elements that doesn't seem to really be based in any kind of hard science. So I think Star Trek seems to be this interesting kind of amalgam of both, right? Now there are some things that are more purely science fiction. For example, the Academy Award nominated The Martian from last year, right? This is a good example of kind of pure science fiction. There's not really, he doesn't go there and, discover that there's a malevolent force on Mars that's, nothing like that. It's man against nature kind of science fiction, right? But I think as we think of this in kind of broad terms, we're going to think of fantasy very broadly in this way. But I'm going to focus on myths and fairy stories for what we're doing here. So, Dr. Reynolds referred to the classic essay by Tolkien on fairy stories. Fairy stories, Tolkien says, if you haven't read this, by the way, you should read it and be a better person for it. It's a really good essay. Fairy stories are about fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves and witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. It's one of my favorite quotes from that essay. So if fictional objects are real, certainly fairy stories and myths have objects, and these things are real too. In a sense, that's true, but myths and fairy stories function in certain and different ways. At a minimum, we can say that what makes myths and fairy stories different from each other is not the way in which they are real, but rather the way in which they function. So Tolkien makes this distinction about function, and he says that there are basically three kinds of functions that a fairy story has. They can function as escape, as recovery, and as consolation. They perform all of these functions. But Tolkien says that the most important of these is this last one, because he gives it a specific name. This is eucatastrophe. Eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears. It produces its peculiar effect because it is a sudden glimpse of truth. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to talk about subcreation. This is also that part that in the Q&A with Dr. Reynolds, he alluded to this, right? When somebody asked about how we can say whether or not a car is beautiful, what gives us kind of the tools for that? Well, it's subcreation. Subcreation is defined by Tolkien as an art by which a secondary world is created. Subcreation is skillful creation of a secondary world which has its own universe, history, and people. In this sense, subcreation is an imitation of the creation in which we live. The essence of subcreation is given in Tolkien's summary statement about fairy stories. He says, "We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker." The fact that we're made in God's image means that we are creative beings. It's kind of our nature to create, to do. And this, in Mythopoeia and in subcreation, is a particular, I'm going to suggest, apologetically functional way that we do this, right? As Christians. If we're Christians, when we do this, this is kind of how we do it, right? God creates the primary world, and we, in turn and properly, imitate him by subcreating secondary worlds. This work of subcreation is an artful product of the imagination, though it is distinct from it. Tolkien states, the mental power of image making is one thing or aspect, and it should appropriately be called imagination. The achievement of the expression which gives or seems to give, quote, the inner consistency of reality, is indeed another thing or aspect needing another name, art. The operative link between imagination and the final result is subcreation. That's from On Fairy Stories as well. So here we see a kind of triumvirate of the subcreative process. Imagination joined to subcreation by way of art. And this mirrors what we see in the primary world, right? So the secondary world is our subcreative act of creating these worlds like Tolkien did. The primary world is God's creative act of creating the world that we live in. And there's a analogous kind of thing going on here too, right? So we have the primary world where we have perfect imagination joined to creation by way of art, right? So what we're doing is this really effective imitative act. And insofar as it's that, we should be thinking of it that way when we create it. We should also be thinking of it that way when we engage it. Now, I want to point out too here very quickly that I'm not suggesting that the only people who properly subcreate are Christians, right? Because Christians aren't the only ones who are made in the image of God. So I see this as an inherent function of being a person that we do this. So when we do this well, we are subcreating well. Truth is going to be found in what we're subcreating, whether we're Christians or not. Again, my only point is that as a Christian cultural hermeneutist, I need to engage these things in a Christian way, looking for those Christian truths that are going to kind of naturally come out into these things. All right. So that brings us, well, if I click in the right place, that brings us. Fantasy and its apologetic uses. Okay? So there's some functions here, as we've talked about. There's some ways that we can think about fantasy and how we can use them apologetically. Well, the prime one here is going to be this consolation part that Tolkien talks about. Eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn of events, the essential happy ending of fairy stories. But I think we can also look for themes of virtue. We can look for other kinds of Christian themes within the work that we're engaging. But I think when we're approaching and thinking about the gospel, it's going to be this place of eucatastrophe. And we'll get to why. That's going to be what we're looking for in fantasy to engage people apologetically for the truth of the gospel. So, let's get to some examples here of, I got about 10 minutes here that I want to give, so let's get to some examples of eucatastrophe. Obviously, in Lord of the Rings, Frodo on the cracks of doom is the quintessential Tolkien eucatastrophe in Lord of the Rings. But there are some other candidates, even in the story, that presents themselves. For example, the early company being saved from Old Man Willow and from the Barrow-wights. These are these kind of mini eucatastrophes along the way. My favorite out of those is the Barrow-wight one, because you don't see any way that they can get out of this, right? It's Tom Bombadil, right, who also saves them from Old Man Willow, but it's Tom Bombadil who comes out and saves them from this. It's a sudden, joyous, unexpected turn. It's hard to think about this, too, if you're already saturated in the story or if you've been reading this since you were a kid. But I came to these stories late. I came to these stories when I was a student here at Southwestern. And as a student, already interested in this stuff, already thinking about these things, when I engaged these stories, and my friends were really good about not letting on to me. They didn't tell me anything. So I didn't know any of that stuff. And again, remember the spoilers. I didn't know that Gandalf died. I didn't know anything about the Cracks of Doom. I didn't know anything about Smeagol and his role eventually in the kind of penultimate scene of the book. I didn't know about the Scouring of the Shire. I didn't know about any of that stuff. So every time it hit me, it was like, oh, wow, you know? And yeah, so there was something, I don't know, there's something about that. I think that was important for me. In the narrative, I'm sorry, let me move on. Moving on. By the time the early company gets to the Old Man Willow, the gravity of their peril is not all that clear, right? This is why I think the Barrow White one is better. Their salvation from him is rather expected, right? You expect, well, it's this kind of early on. You don't expect the company or anyone in the company to die yet. But if the story had been told on its own, separate from The Lord of the Rings, then perhaps the tale could pass for a pretty strong catastrophe in the context. But in the context that it's in, the tale falls a little bit short of this. So the better candidate is the Barrow White one. We're told by Gandalf himself that this was the most peril the hobbits have been in up to that point in the book. When they talk about that, Gandalf says, well, that was the most dangerous thing that you guys confronted. So I'm sure that you can probably think of other examples. I think certainly the Scouring of the Shire counts here as well. And you can see these as you kind of review these books. We'll talk about how this applies to apologetics here in just a second. So Harry Potter. I think probably the most beautiful story in the Harry Potter series is the story of Snape, right? So you have this figure who has been seen with disdain and with suspicion throughout the entire series, right? Everything he does, everything that you think he does, points to the fact that he's a double agent just ready to pounce. And then you have this great scene, I believe, in the last book where Snape sacrifices himself, and you come to understand exactly what his motivations were and exactly the extents to which he went to save Harry Potter, right? So I won't say any more than that. I know spoilers, but if you know what I'm talking about if you've read the books. Dumbledore's death, another example of sacrifice here, very heavy on the themes of sacrifice. And then finally, obviously, Harry Potter's death. If you're thinking, Harry Potter died? Yeah, he dies in the books. But what's interesting too, and speaking to my point, is that he also is resurrected in the books and ultimately comes and saves the school from Voldemort. Now, when I originally started thinking about how I was going to start things off, I was going to say probably the most controversial thing I do here is not defend Harry Potter, but be critical of apologetics. But I don't think it's such a controversial thing to defend Harry Potter. I like the books. I think they're really good. I've read the stuff that says, oh, it's all witchcraft and all that, and I find it totally unconvincing. And I think specifically if you look at the entire series and you take it all into account, the way the series unfolds and maps out clearly makes it a kind of Christian myth that I think we should take seriously. Logan, last night, Logan. I'm not going to spoil it, I promise. But if you're interested in seeing it and you go see it, look for the themes of sacrifice, the themes of purpose and meaning, of brokenness and redemption. The themes are very heavy there. I have notes here. Don't spoil it, because I was like, I'm just going to get excited and talk about it. Don't spoil it. My wife this morning, when I was coming, I'm gonna wrap up here. But my wife, before I came this morning, I was talking to her about some last-minute thoughts and things. And she said, "Oh, well, I wanted to tell you that last night, because I was here and went to go see the movie with my friends." She said, "Last night, the kids and I watched My Giant." Have you guys seen that? It's a cartoon from the 90s, I believe. Huh? Iron Giant, not My Giant. My Giant is a Billy Crystal. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thanks. Glad you're here, Zach. Thanks. not completely different movies. Yeah. Iron Giant, cartoon out of the 90s. You guys, that's ringing more bells. Okay, good, yeah. We see the Billy Crystal fans in the room. Yeah, so Iron Giant, right? I haven't seen this in a while, but my wife watched it with the kids last night. And apparently there's a part in the movie where the giant repeats the kid's words back to himself, right? The kid at one point had said, I'm going to go here, you stay here, do not follow me. Well, in an effort to protect not just the kid, but the entire planet, because there's like a nuclear bomb that's about to go off or something, the giant tells the kid, I'm going to go, you stay here, do not follow me. And then he goes off and he sacrifices himself and saves the kid and the planet, right? And my wife, and we kind of had this moment this morning where we were almost kind of in tears over this. Part of that's probably because I was so tired. But she says, we're sitting there and my son Grayson, 10 years old, it's like a light pops off in his head and he looks and he goes, Mommy, he says, that's just like what Jesus did for us, right? This is that kind of engagement that we should all be having, right, as Christian apologists when we think about these things. That's just like what Jesus did for us. And this is that point of apologetic context, right, or contact, okay? So I want to move on. Narnia, these things are obvious. I know that Dr. Gould is going to talk about the Narnia stuff here, so we'll just skip over that. I got a lot of things to say there, but we'll slip. Negative examples, Twilight. I like saying this. You'll pardon the kind of saucy nature in which I say this, but I like to say to my students when we talk about this stuff, if you don't know by now, Twilight sucks. So it's just objective fact, right? So I think there's a lot of things that we can get from this, though, right? So we can still engage this properly, right, Christianly. How? Well, we can see the places where it is problematic. It doesn't just suck because it's, sorry, I'm going to keep using that word. I feel like I'm at Weatherford talking to my students. But it's not just bad because it's poorly written, although I think it probably is. It's bad because there are certain themes that are displayed there that are not good. The kind of stuff that Dr. Reynolds was talking about earlier, right? This kind of objectification of women, this low value and low view of women, right? A woman only has worth insofar as she's in a relationship with a man. The codependency, right? Love means that you can't live without the other person. Well, I hope not, because we're temporary on this earth. And one of these days, statistically, it'll be me. I'm going to die, and my wife will still be there. And if love means that she can't live without me, then she's going to want to try to kill herself, and that just doesn't seem right. But this is kind of the centerpiece for what's going on in Twilight. So there's a lot more to say there, but I'll leave it. His Dark Materials, if you're not familiar with this is Philip Pullman's kind of effort to write an atheist sort of Chronicles of Narnia. Now, it's not that, right? So it's not like, it's much more imaginative than that. I want to give him credit. And I've read some stuff by some Christians about this, and they kind of talk about how the book is poorly written, it's bad, and all the rest. I don't really think that. I actually enjoyed the book. I thought it was pretty much well written. Now, I will say that the kids who are supposed to be 10 or 11 and 12 or something like that, they don't talk like 11 and 12-year-olds, right? And so in that sense, there's some kind of, you got to get over that, right? But I think it's fairly well written. But it is a kind of atheist version of what Lewis was up to, right? So he's pushing a kind of anti-authoritarian, anti-church kind of message, and sometimes it smacks you right in the eyes. There's no subtlety about it. But I'm going to leave that for you if you're interested in reading through that. I would suggest that you engage those things, that you engage the things that may not promote the Christian worldview so that you can engage them with others, so that you can address them and engage them properly. All right. And finally, the gospel. The gospel is a kind of fairy story. This is Tolkien's view. but it's a kind of fairy story that is fundamentally true. Now, remember that the prime function of the fairy tale is eucatastrophe. So in this context, this is how Tolkien's thinking about this. It is the great eucatastrophe. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history, and the resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. So right there, if we're looking for these eucatastrophic ways of thinking about the fantasies that we engage, then this gives us an automatic connection to the gospel and of presenting this and of defending it and thinking about it. The way I like to say it is, why do we resonate with these fantastical stories? Why do we tear up at the eucatastrophe? Why are we moved when Gollum bites the ring off of Frodo's finger and falls into the cracks of doom? Why is that moving? Well, justice is a part of it, but I suggest that because we deep down kind of suspect that there's something wrong in our primary world, that there's a brokenness that we see reflected in the story that we're reading, right? And that there's a sudden joyous turn for us too, right? If there's a sudden and joyous turn here, if this story is eucatastrophic, it seems like we may have that here too, and we do. And it's the gospel. It's Christ. So, I'm sorry, I know I'm out of time. This leads us to sharing our personal eucatastrophe, right? Again, notice that when we engage people apologetically with fantasy, then this gives us a front and center opportunity to share our faith, right? Because we're not focused on what arguments can I give. We're focused on what ways can I clarify and defend my faith to this person. What ways can I give them the gospel message? And if arguments come up, then that's great. So that's that. Let me say this one last thing, and then I'll move on. Or then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A, I think. So when we engage these things apologetically, right, we meet people where they are. I think I said that before, right? Not everybody is interested in the ontological. Not everybody is interested in the cosmological arguments. But engaging on this realm of popular culture, right, cultural engagement, in this case fantasy, we're engaging people in a place where they already are. They feel comfortable, right? This isn't manipulative. It may be opportunistic, but it's not manipulative, right? Because now that I'm engaged them there, if they're not interested in talking about the cosmological argument or the ontological argument, that's fine. We can still have a conversation about the gospel and about what the faith is, and I can give a kind of defense for that. But if this leads them to ask questions about, well, why do you think that God exists? Well, now I have a context even here to go into some of the arguments that I may point to that support my belief, the kind of reasons that are available to me, right? So I think that when we think about it this way, we can escape some of these criticisms that Penner is talking about. We're engaging a person for who they are, not for a label that we put on them. And in so doing, I think we can best minister the gospel to those people. Thank you. I'm sorry I went too long, but we got about 5 minutes, so. Yeah, Zach, go ahead.
Great talk. I've often been curious when this topic comes up, the sort of the cultural engagement, dealing with fantastical literature, et cetera. Because as you mentioned, you see a lot of these same biblical themes reflected in a lot of these works. Do you think it would be possible to communicate the truth of the gospel by referencing those works alone, like, for example, The Rings or certainly Narnia, but Harry Potter perhaps, without referring to the Bible at all?
Do I think it would be possible to
communicate the gospel message without referring to the Bible, to the gospel itself, using these sort of sub-created?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So in one sense, I want to say yes, but at the same time, if the gospel just is the story of Christ coming, dying, being raised from the dead, right? If this is kind of essential to the gospel, then I'm going to have to talk about those things, right? If I'm going to talk about the gospel, right? Because otherwise, what am I telling them about, right? I'm telling them about this really nice story and this eucatastrophe, but if I'm not pointing it back to the story of Christ, then I don't think I'm sharing the gospel, right? And insofar as the story of Christ is given in Scripture, I think I'm kind of wedded to at least pointing to the Bible minimally, at least. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Something that when we talk about fantasy that kind of hit me that we didn't really talk about was Game of Thrones. And with that, also kind of, do you think that we talk about negative and positive fantasy? Do you think that's a believer's freedom, or do you believe that some fantasy is objectively wrong?
Yeah, so I would say that what Dr. Reynolds talked about, I mean, a lot of the things that he says, and even actually some of the illustration, not that he and I are whatever, but I actually use that stuff when I talk to some of my students about my own views about art and beauty. And so I think that he's right on about what he's talking about there. And so I think that there's a subjective element insofar as we can say, I prefer, right, as far as preference goes. But as far as whether something is objective or beautiful or useful or something like that, I think that those are more or less objective. Now, I've never seen Game of Thrones, so I don't know. But I do think, like, so example, as I go back to the negative examples, Twilight and His Dark Materials trilogy, I call those negative examples because they don't put forth any of those things that we can utilize apologetically, right? So there's no gospel, there's no eucatastrophe, there's no gospel message, there's none of those elements that make for the kind of good story that Tolkien identifies as being useful in this way. So I think there is an objective way we can evaluate and think about those things. But there's also preference, right? Not everybody's going to be a Tolkien fan. I mean, everybody's entitled to be wrong, so, you know. Yeah.
So on the topic of dealing with speculative fiction would be kind of the big category that includes fantasy, sci-fi, horror. So engaging with culture in terms of speculative fiction, to what degree would you place an emphasis on maintaining cultural relevance? I mean, sure, Lord of the Rings is very popular, and The Hobbit, and Harry Potter, but people kind of move past those stories. And
Right.
Stories like The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones,
Right.
Those are more sort of hot topics, if you will.
Right.
And yes, some of those are perhaps content-wise a little heavier, maybe requiring a little more discernment. But
Right.
to what degree, to be effective in engaging culture in an apologetic way with the use of speculative fiction, do we need to stay up on sort of the stories that the culture currently cares about?
Right. No, that's a good question. I like that. Yeah, I think that this may get kind of to personal taste stuff here, right? Because again, I'm not suggesting that it's our duty now as Christians to go out and consume as much as possible. What I am saying, though, is that as we go out and consume popular culture, in this case, fantasy fiction, again, don't miss the overall point. If fantasy's not your bag, I'm not suggesting you have to read Lord of the Rings to be a good witness for the gospel. But there's something out there that you're interested in on a popular cultural level, right? And that's a place where you can engage that culture in the ways that I've described for a witness to the gospel, right? And there are some ways where it's going to be obvious. Like in fantasy, there's a very obvious kind of connection, I think. It's going to be a lot harder to figure out how to do that. For example, with sports. Say that you're a sports fanatic. Well, how do I engage that Christianly in such a way that I can use that engagement to witness the gospel to other people? That's going to be a harder, but my point is that as Christians, I think what we are obliged to is to engage culture Christianly and thoughtfully. We don't need to be mere consumers of entertainment, because when we are mere consumers of entertainment, when we think of entertainment for entertainment's sake, again, pointing back to Dr. Reynolds, then we are making entertainment an idol in our lives. There's nothing wrong with entertainment, but what we need to do is make sure that when we engage it thoughtfully and to the glory of God. And that's what I'm suggesting here. So. Yes, ma'am.
Just out of curiosity, what was the storyline of his Dark Materials?
Okay, so you're familiar, right, Zach? So it's been a while since I've read it, and I know that if I get something wrong, Zach's going to correct me. But in a nutshell, you've got two kind of universes. There are actually multiple universes. And there's this material in the universe called dust that kind of coalesces around truth, right? Coalesces, rather, around truth. And the kind of function of the story is that you have these powers that try to control people's understanding and ability to discern where the dust is. And that's the church, and it's bad. So you have this kind of story of a kind of subversive effort to bring down the church. There's actually a part in one of the books where God shows up, and he's like this really old angel, and they literally kill God. Literally kill God, right? There's a fallen nun. She makes some statement at one point about the Christian church is this well-meaning idea that doesn't really work out, or it's something like that, right? Do you know the quote I'm talking about? Yeah, but yeah, it's something along those lines. And then ultimately the story kind of culminates in these two children who have kind of been going along, kind of having their own Adam and Eve moment, and kind of giving in to what Adam and Eve denied, and it's a good thing, because now that the church has been subverted, or more or less, and God is dead, then they are free to do what they want, what they see is right in their own eyes. So, now that's my colored version of it. Zach would probably give you a different read on this, and that's yeah. But I think the fundamentals of the story we're pretty right on. Yeah. So, all right. Anybody else? I think we're maybe one more. Yeah.
This is like a super dumb question.
Okay, I'll let you know if it is.
Would you like call this whole field? Because I hear like this kind of happens a lot, but I don't know what the whole what is this? If I want to read more about this, what do I?
Okay, so I don't know. I refer to this as cultural hermeneutics, but there are a lot of books about the Christian engagement with culture. So you've got the very popular Open Court series, Philosophy and Culture. A lot of those are edited by Christians, and a lot of Christians contribute to those. So there would be one. You have books like Jim Spiegel and Paul, do you know? Is that it? The one about going to engaging the movies, right? So you can find these kinds of books out there. I should have brought a list of resources. I'm sorry I didn't. But okay, right, yeah. So, all right. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate you coming.